Welcome everyone to a special webinar today. This is a webinar we've designed really for our Social Suite customers to talk today about the ISSB standards that have been released. Now you might be here today having heard a lot about that, having followed the news, or you might be here today and don't really know what it means. Either way, we're here to give you some insights on what those standards are, what it means to your business, and some key takeaways about what you should be doing right now. So the aim today is to create a first, hopefully, in a series of webinars in which we'll engage more directly with our customers, with the people that we work with on a day-to-day basis to really help you on your ESG journey. So I really invite you today to use the chat here. I realize it's a first in terms of creating a customer forum, and it is a bit one-sided today hearing me talk, and you can only use the chat, but we really want to understand as well going forward how we can really move this forward and create a forum where we can share insights, where we can learn best practices from each other. So I really kind of encourage you today to put a lot of questions in the chat while I'm talking and explaining on the slides what the ISSB is. Really put those questions in there, and then going forward, hopefully, we can move maybe to another forum to see if a Google Meet or a Zoom call would be better to really drive more of that interaction. So as much as we're going to talk today about the ISSB, we'd love to get some feedback at the end of this webinar as well about the format and how we can really better work together in a customer forum to get a sense of what are the things that you really want to know in terms of ESG topics, and also that engagement with other customers and learning from each other. So over the last few years, I've been really watching the ESG landscape and trying to understand where things are moving. And one of the things that we've seen quite early on already is that, as you probably know, that massive amount of ESG standards, acronyms, it's all over the place. It's far from a clear set of metrics or standards or a clear set of things that you need to do. Now, what's happening, which started really, I think, early in 2020 or even just before that, is that move towards the unification of ESG. Now, we saw that the World Economic Forum, with their framework on stakeholder capitalism metrics, were really the pioneer in that space. We're a strong proponent of that unification. It really helps everyone if we have one global set of ESG standards and metrics that we all report on. That makes everyone's life a lot easier. So we've been really following that. We've anticipating where the market's moving, and what we see today, what we're going to talk about today, the ISSB, is really the next step in that process. So we're following that and really want to share with you where things are at today and what it means going forward. So what does that mean today? What we're going to look at, there's three parts today. And the first part is I want to explain to you a high-level overview of what the ISSB is, and for that matter as well, what the IFRS is. What are those new standards and how does that all work? So keeping it high level. But there is some benefit after that to really briefly do a quick deep dive. And it's not meant to be overwhelming, but there are a few slides there that have quite a few boxes on there that relate to each other. But the whole purpose is to show you how did we end up here today? Where are we in terms of voluntary reporting? Where are we today in terms of mandatory reporting? What's emerging around regulation? And how do those things all align or link to that new standard from the ISSB? So I'll keep that quite brief there, and I really invite questions when we get to that point there. But it's really a landscape overview there that I like to show you. Then after that, the key takeaways, and I think that's the core of today. It is building up to what is that World Economic Forum framework that you've been reporting on now, and how does that sit in that new standard from the ISSB? We'll talk about it as a readiness tool. We'll look at what do you actually need to report on in terms of the ISSB or IFRS standards, and how can we get ready working together? What can you do, and how can Social Suite help you with that? That's the three components. I hope I can get through that in the next 15 to 20 minutes. Like I said, you can keep your questions to the end, but also feel free, put them in the chat. Ideally, we just get on to them as soon as you raise them. So the first part here, And we're going to look at what are the IFRS and the ISSB and why is it important. So the first part there, the IFRS, if you look at the diagram here that I've made on the right there, is the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation. Now, they were founded in 2001, but really they've been existing since 1973 on a slightly different name. But they were created in the 70s with the idea that if as a corporation we do financial reporting, ideally we all use the same standard, the same accounting, so that everyone can compare your financial statements. So they created the IASB, the International Accounting Standards Board. So you see that in that kind of green color there. That was also created in the 70s, had a name change in 2001, but that's been around for a long time. And for the last decades, they've really set and driven and developed the financial and accounting standards that organizations globally use. So everything's comparable. Now, lately, with that rise in ESG and sustainability reporting, they realized that we do need a similar process for sustainability. So they created in 2021 the International Sustainability Standards Board. So the IFRS Foundation is two arms now. On the one hand, they still have that financial accounting standards board, and on the other hand, they have the new Sustainability Standards Board. And that new ISSB had four objectives. The first one, to develop that global baseline of sustainability disclosures, and really specifically to make sure it meets the information needs of investors. So that's quite important to realize that this body and this standard are focused on capital markets and on what the information investors need. So it's not that broader set of stakeholders that some other frameworks look at. So you might be familiar with the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI. They are generally seen as a broader ESG initiative that investors might find useful, but also different other stakeholders, from employees and suppliers and customers, the general public, environmentalists. There's a lot in there that provides more information than the core material information that investors need to inform their decision making. The third part is then to really enable companies to provide comprehensive sustainability information. So what that means is material metrics that investors need that are comprehensive enough to inform them, but also at the same time don't overburden a company in providing everything that they have around sustainability. And the fourth part is ensuring that whatever is happening is really a facilitation of interoperability. That means that whatever new standards are being created, that they work with what's already out there, existing other frameworks and standards, that they're aligned with any new and emerging standards or regulation, and that it all works together. So that's quite important in this emerging landscape, that we don't get double disclosing, that everything fits and works together. What the ISSB then said is, there's a lot of good information already out there, so let's not start from scratch, from zero. What we can use is existing standards, frameworks, lessons learned that we can bring together. So there's some pieces of the puzzle here that we can merge together into this new set of sustainability standards. So what we see here on the bottom left is they've really picked out a few things that are quite, for a lot of people, quite familiar. If you haven't heard of them, there's some of those larger standards or frameworks out there. The Climate Disclosure Standards Board, CDSB, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the Integrated Reporting Framework, the ISSB standards, and the World Economic Forum Stakeholder Capitalism Metrics. They're quite at the top of all the global frameworks used in voluntary ESG reporting. Like I said, the key one missing there is GRI. They're quite different. They sit outside of this, but we'll get to that in a moment as well in a few slides. And I'll position where GRI sits in relation to this. So what that means is that they've created now two new standards. And it's quite interesting that when you look at the media and the news, there's a lot of talk about the ISSB standards, but formally what you find is that they're called the IFRS standards, S1 and S2. And S1 is the first sustainability standards on general requirements, so that's your general ESG, and S2 is really focused on climate. So when I talk about the ISSB standards or the IFRS standards, they're effectively the same colloquial, they're known as the ISSB standards, but formally we see now that there's a move towards using that more the IFRS standards S1 and S2. Both of them are built according to a structure that is focusing on four components. That is governance, strategy, and risk management. And they are really more, I would say, narrative driven. And what is interesting is that you're familiar already with the WEF reporting, and you see in there in that governance section, but across all those pillars there in that WEF framework, that you are indeed required to look at some metrics and some data, but it's very narrative driven in that sense. So you're already quite familiar with that style of explain how your board is governing a particular process. How is your business looking at risk management? And rather than providing a metric, a quantitative data, you're already reporting more qualitative and incorporating some of those data points in there. That is really the first part, those three components there. And then there is the metrics and targets part. And that is really that component where you start to get into more of not exclusively, but more in a set number of data points that you're providing. So, like I said, the structure of this is based on what we've already learned, what's already out there. So in the middle, you see here the exposure draft of one of those standards. And what they did is they said, like we looked at the structure there, that is coming pretty much directly from the TCFD, so that Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures that was founded in 2015. They use that structure of governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. That has been used by a lot of companies. A lot of companies are really familiar with that, and it's proven to be a very good structure. So they said, that's a great piece of the puzzle. We'll use that approach. Equally, they said, there's no point in us looking at what metrics we're going to develop when there are really good metrics already out there. They've looked at ISSB, which is already really developed for investors. They have 77 industry-specific standards that are a good starting point to look at your materiality. And they can fit really into that box metrics and targets. So it's really a building blocks to bring that standard together. And what they've said then around the World Economic Forum, and we'll get to that in a bit further on as well, is that they see that initial pioneering of the unification of a lot of standards by the World Economic Forum as a readiness tool for the actual reporting on both these IFRS standards. So they say if you get started with WEF and if you do that well and you understand how that works, you're getting yourself ready on the pathway towards reporting here. Now, in the reporting here, the standards, they're out now. They were released last week. They come into force, so to say, from the 1st of January next year, looking back over 2023 for any companies that want to or have to start reporting on it. And we'll get to that later as well, like when should you start reporting on it. But what that means is that the next 6 months, we're really going to look at how is the market going to respond. In particular, are companies making commitments to start reporting on this? What are regulators going to do? There's already a lot in market, and we'll look at that in a moment as well, how that aligns with emerging regulation. So there's a lot happening in this space. And the final high-level overview is that, as we've seen, the IFRS does two things. They manage the global accounting standards, and they're now trying to do the same for sustainability standards. So where they're moving towards is saying, really, what we need to do is provide investors in capital markets, not with two sets of data. We need to move towards integration. We need to integrate financial statements with sustainability disclosures. But effectively, they're the non-financial and the financial disclosures of one company. So they shouldn't sit in different places, in different reports. They need to be connected. They need to be linked up together. So this is something that over time, people are moving towards, but there's still a lot of things emerging and developing. So this is more to put on your radar and where things in time probably will move. Today, I've highlighted again with a red box here, we're going to talk about a bit more about those sustainability standards. So as the next step then is, how did we end up here? So how does those IFRS standards, how do they fit in the global ESG landscape? And like I warned you at the start, is this might look a little overwhelming, but bear with me. It just demonstrates how things fit together. There's a lot more even out there, but this is a snapshot of how you could look at it. And I'll talk you through where things stand, where voluntary reporting is at, where mandatory reporting is at, and then we'll get into the next section, which should kind of lift things up a little bit more. So this is a brief history or overview of the unification of ESG reporting and really coming from that voluntary reporting perspective. Now that's where the world has started. ESG has really been heavily investor driven, voluntary reporting. So what we see here at the very top is some of those well-known standards and frameworks. And except for the GRI at the top left side there, the oldest framework with the broadest set of stakeholders there, all the others here listed, the CDSB, the IRRC, the ISSB and TCFD, all of them have been used and kind of merged into the IFRS Foundation in terms of creating that new standard. So you remember from the first slide, the core here, the IFRS Foundation, the IASB and the ISSB with their two standards. So I've added at the top some of those frameworks to show how they've been integrated. But then also I've added to the right-hand side the World Economic Forum. As I flagged, they were the first pioneer to start doing this work, combining the best of those frameworks in one easy starting point for companies. And that's what you see at the bottom right there, the stakeholder capitalism metrics. And they are now, like I said, seen as a readiness tool to start reporting on those IFRS S1 and S2 standards. So if you're doing work already on WEF, I would say generally what the message is right now, keep doing that work, keep building your disclosures, keep understanding how this reporting works to put yourself in a position that when these things come into force from next year, if you want to, and if it's the right time in your journey, you're in a position to start reporting there. What I've also done is there's a lot of questions around how does all this relate to what the Europeans are doing. So in Europe, you have the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, and they are basically a European body that liaises with the IFRS Foundation, like the World Economic Forum. They all have these MOUs and partnerships that they continuously talk, and most of what they do is trying to align. So that's that core message from the start, that whatever's happening, it needs to be globally aligned. People don't want to operate in a vacuum or a silo, and that whatever you do in the US is not working in the EU and you need to do it twice. We really want to avoid that. Unfortunately, that is definitely on the radar there. Now, the Europeans have issued this Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in 2021. We're looking now at alignment with those ISSB standards. They're working their way through. They really want to avoid double disclosure of reporting. So there's a lot happening in that space. Not everything has been ironed out. There's a lot of questions still, but there's ongoing dialogue. So that's really an encouraging thing to see. So if we just focus for a moment in a bit of a simplified way on that voluntary ESG reporting space and where things are today. This is a very simplistic view. I realize that there's a lot more you could add to this, but I think it's useful to put that ISSB standard at S1 and S2 in the middle there, see what is incorporated in there. So we see that S1 is really based on this on the SASB metrics from that metrics point of view. S2 is really incorporating, because it's climate focused, a lot of from the existing climate framework TCFD, and then there is those components from the IRC, their integrated reporting framework, CDSB, and the WEF stakeholder capitalism metrics are that entry point into those standards. This is again really created for investors, for capital markets. So we see that the GRI Global Reporting Initiative, with that wider set of stakeholders, sits outside of this. Again, there is a MOU and there's a partnership and there's alignment talks between GRI and ISSB to ensure that it works together. And even there, in terms of where I've put the SASB now under IFRS S1, in the standard itself, it also says that you can use components from GRI in terms of the metrics. So there's quite a bit of flexibility there. And over the first few I think months and years of adoption of these new standards, we will see where companies move and what the components are that are going to use to deliver on reporting on these standards. On the right hand side, there's a lot still out there. So yes, we're moving towards unifying that ESG landscape, but there's a lot of other industry specific standards that you'll still run into. There will be new ones. There will be anything from guidance, frameworks, standards, to targets. So think about the SDGs, which are really goals and targets. Think about the SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So there's a lot still there. There is high-level things like the UN Global Compact, the UN Principles of Responsible Investment. So there's still a lot of other things that you could be a member of, that you could be reporting against, that you could be delivering against. But this at least offers a very investor-focused, clear set of reporting standards that you can get started with. And I think WEF, like I said, is a great entry point in moving into that space. Then, before we just move out into a bit more, like I said, the key takeaways and high level, what is happening from a mandatory point of view? I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just show that we're definitely into this and really trying to work out what's going on. From a social suite perspective, we find that most of our customers are in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and Canada. We do have a few people with footprints in the European Union or doing business there. And since they're really the front runners, I've put them on here as well. They do a lot around ESG and climate. So we need to make sure that we're across that as well. But what's showing here is that everyone in terms of compliance, regulation, mandatory reporting is focused first and foremost on climate. Climate is the name of the game at the moment. So that's where you see all these initiatives focused. Australia is saying clearly we're seeking practical alignment with the ISSB, with their IFRS S2 standard. So whatever that means, we'll see in hopefully in the next few months. New Zealand already has through the XRB, they already have a mandatory climate reporting, but they're looking at expanding that. There's consultation going in, and we'll hear in due course how they're going to align with the S2 standard. In terms of the United States, where we see the SEC rules on climate disclosure, we're still waiting for them. We've heard a lot about that. I expect it to have a bit of a lighter touch than the ISSB. We'll see if that's true and how that plays out. So I'm not entirely sure, but there will be some alignment there and hopefully sufficient alignment. Canada has said that they're looking at direct implementation. So hopefully that will be very straightforward, that they say the IFRS S2 is what you need to do. That will just make it very easy for a lot of companies. And in terms of the European Union, there's still those ongoing discussions there. The Europeans are pretty strict. What we hear is that it's likely that if you're reporting in Europe under the CSRD, if you're doing that work, you're ticking all the boxes for the IFRS S2. The other way, probably not. So we think that the Europeans are a bit stricter on what they require. So if you only do IFRS S2, you might need to do a little bit more for European reporting. But again, they're trying to avoid double reporting and additional work. So maybe there will be a bit more of movement there in terms of alignment. So that's a really quick snapshot on how they align with the ISSB and where their thinking is around mandatory reporting. Then finally, like I said, how does the WEF framework align with the IFRS standard, and what are some of those key takeaways and considerations in your ESG journey going forward? They clearly expressed in an MOU between the World Economic Forum and the ISSB. They came together, they have an MOU, have a partnership, they're working out how they can together best deliver sustainability and ESG disclosure and reporting. And they said that initial set of stakeholder metrics is really a readiness tool for companies that are interested in due course to start preparing for reporting on the IFRS standards. So like I said, is if you take those WEF pillars on the left there, the governance section really already does a lot of work on the IFRS governance strategy risk management. So you're already, if you're reporting on that, have a lot of qualitative narrative-driven disclosures that will feed into that process. In terms of your planet, people, and prosperity in that WEF framework, there are definitely some more metrics in there that will feed into some of those metrics and targets from the IFRS, but there will always be additional components that you can supplement your reporting with. Materiality assessment in any case is always a good thing to do. In terms of material industry specific metrics, SASB is a good starting point to look at. GRI is also mentioned by the IFRS. So there are things to look at in terms of what do your stakeholders demand, what metrics are relevant. GHG inventory, understanding your carbon footprint, in this day and age, it's almost a given. You better get started with that. Like I said, climate is on everyone's mind. Any regulation will first and foremost be focused on climate. So I would say if there's any takeaway is that get started around climate. Understand your carbon footprint. That's really step one, because after that, there's a lot more you should and could be doing, including TCFD reporting. So there's a lot of things there, but at least you're already on that pathway. And that's what, like I said at the start of today's webinar, we anticipated some years back that this is where things are moving, and that a WEF framework is really an easy entry point for companies to get onto this pathway. So what's next then? And do you really need to report on the IFRS standards? Now, before we trying to give you the information to answer that question, there's no hard yes or no, but the main things to remember about the ISSB or IFRS standards are that they're global ESG disclosures. So hopefully we see really global adoption there. For now, and by nature of them, they're voluntary reporting until they've been formally adopted by a regulator. So for now, it's just voluntary reporting, so it's up to you. They do unify a lot of existing things that are already out there and that you might already be doing. They're really designed for investors, so keep that in mind, which is maybe a good thing. Could also be that you might want to add some additional information if you're different stakeholders that demand different things. There's a lot of international support behind the IFRS. The G20, G7 has already said this is where we should be going. A lot of international organizations, regulators have said we're watching this space. We do want to align or adopt the IFRS standards. There's that movement towards connecting with financial statements, which in the long term is a good thing. And they're really trying to have that interoperability with broader ESG reporting, emerging standards. So keeping all that in mind, should I report? Well, look at what your investors are asking for. What is their demand? Are they, already asking you from 1st of January, I want to see this? Maybe start thinking about it. But it really depends where you are in your ESG journey. Is it being mandated by a regulator? Well, you probably have to do it then. So watch that space and we will keep you informed there. Or do you want to be really proactive? So we definitely have some customers that have a ESG leads, few ESG people that say, we want to be leading here in our industry. We want to be the pioneers. So this is what I want to do. So there's a few things to consider. But then that question for now is the WEF framework enough? Yes, it helps you get ready. It gets you on the pathway. It really informs a lot of the components, the building blocks for ultimately in some point in time, when it's the right time for your business on that pathway to do that work. So right now you're really putting the right things together. So really consider if it's the right fit for your journey and when that comes in. And what we will do is really talk with you through your timeline, where you are in reporting. So our ESG coaches can help with that. And it's tailored for you where you are. Like I said, what your investors want, your stakeholders, your regulation, and where you sit in that capacity and how proactive you want to be, what the right time would be to, keep adding components to at some point automatically do the IFRS reporting. So together we can definitely do this, get onto that pathway to IFRS, but really what do you need to do today? Not a lot. So the best thing you can do to prepare is just continue with your ESG journey. Understand what your material ESG topics are, keep reporting on them. So use that WEF framework. If you feel that there are additional topics you want to report on that are material and that are not in your current reporting, the WEF has, outside of their 21 core metrics, 34 expanded metrics. So really ensure you talk to your ESG coach, looking at them, or flag with what's on your mind in terms of topics. It's a pretty broad set of metrics, so it covers a lot. Like I said, start thinking about your GHG footprint. If you don't know that yet, we can definitely get you on the way there. Listen to your stakeholders and investors. What do they really want from you? And reach out to us if you have any questions. So on the flip side then, what will we do? We can help you with the materiality assessment. We have a tool that is about to be released that will really help you do a quick and simple survey-based materiality assessment under your stakeholders. So talk to your ESG coach about that if that's something you'd like to do. Get help with your GHG inventory. So I think that is something we can really get you on the right pathway with as well. We continue to map the IFRS standards, work out that pathway, look at the global adoption of those standards, the commitments companies are making, and in particular as well, what are regulators doing? How are they going to move forward with any of this? And then finally, we're here for your questions. So on that point, I see that Mike's put a question in there. He's asking about the acronyms, a lot to understand and how it all involves. If I can share the slides, yes, definitely. So what we'll do, the slides, but also the webinar will be available to our customers. So we'll ensure that you get both the slides and the link to this webinar. I realize that those 3 slides with that diagram on there, that may take a little bit of digesting that and really looking at what it all means. There's a lot in here, and we've compressed it in a short bit of time. So I would say if you have any questions, love to hear in the chat, but also feel free to follow up with me. I've got my email on here. Reach out to me with your questions about the ISSB, about ESG in general, but also about this type of webinar customer forum. If you have any feedback, if you have any particular topics that you'd like to see moving forward, please let us know and we can do something. And if you'd like it to be more interactive, let us know as well. We can set up a different format going forward. So love to hear from you. If there's no more questions, then we'll wrap for today, and feel free to reach out to me with any of the questions you have. Thanks so much.